Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a nation that exists because of an experiment, one born not in Africa, but in the minds of American elites. Liberia, a country that calls itself free, founded by freed slaves, but whose roots are tangled in contradiction, power, and design. Here's the question: what happens when a nation is engineered by people who never intend to live there themselves? Let's start at the beginning. In the year 1816, a group of American elites, slaveholders from the South, and abolitionists from the North, came together under one banner, the American Colonization Society, or ACS. Sounds strange already, right? How could two groups with such radically different moral beliefs come together to back the same cause? Well, that's where it gets interesting. The ACS was created with one goal in mind: to relocate freed African Americans to Africa. But the reasons behind this initiative couldn't have been more different. Southern slaveholders feared that the presence of freed black people in the United States would inspire rebellion among the enslaved. Their support was about control, containment, keep the problem at arm's length. Meanwhile, many Northern abolitionists believed that African Americans would never be treated fairly in a racist America. Their support came from a place of resignation and, perhaps, misplaced idealism. But this wasn't just a grassroots movement. This had elite backing. Presidents like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison discreetly endorsed the ACS. Why? Because it served as a kind of pressure valve, a way to relieve the mounting tension in a divided nation. If slavery couldn't be ended peacefully, maybe those who were freed could be sent somewhere else, somewhere far. It wasn't framed as deportation. It was marketed as liberation. But let's pause right there. When people speak of liberation, they usually don't mean it comes with a one-way ticket, funded by elites, to a land they've never seen. This is where the contradictions begin. The ACS's mission lived in a paradox, talking of freedom, while driven by the need for control. On paper, it sounded like an act of generosity. In practice, it echoed something far more complicated, maybe even sinister. And this wasn't just a loose movement. This was one of the earliest forms of state-sponsored resettlement, a formal, government-endorsed relocation of people based on ideological goals. These weren't just personal decisions to return to ancestral lands. This was organized, structured, and funded, a social experiment conducted at scale. So here we are, in the early 1800s, watching a nation being conceived, not by its own people, but by the ambitions of another, not as a result of natural migration, but as a geopolitical outlet for American tensions. And that is where the story begins. After the first ship set sail and the settlers landed, the American Colonization Society's grand experiment took root on African soil. But this wasn't a spontaneous new beginning. It was a carefully planted seed, one grown in foreign soil, but watered with distinctly American ideals and American power structures. By 1847, Liberia formally declared independence. But make no mistake, this was not a grassroots uprising or a revolution in the classic sense. It was more like a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a nation pre-designed by a committee. The people who declared independence were not native to the region. They were freed African Americans, known as Americo-Liberians, who brought with them not only their hopes for freedom but also the political blueprints of the country they'd left behind. And so, Liberia's constitution was born, but it looked oddly familiar. It mirrored the United States almost point for point. Separation of powers, executive, legislative, judicial branches. A republic on paper, but here's the twist: a republic is only as strong as its sense of unity, and Liberia had none. You had a small, transplanted population of Americo-Liberians trying to recreate the American system in a land with entirely different cultures, histories, and indigenous peoples. These settlers, many of whom had never been to Africa before, were suddenly in charge of building a government, enforcing laws, and managing land that had been home to others for generations. The result? Division. Very quickly, Americo-Liberians began to form a ruling class. They lived in coastal settlements, built houses that resembled southern plantations, and viewed indigenous Africans not as equals, but as outsiders. Sound familiar? This created a new hierarchy. The very people who had escaped oppression in America were now building systems that excluded others. It wasn't just political, it was economic. The American Colonization Society, which had funded much of Liberia's infrastructure, laid the groundwork for centralized land ownership. Large tracts were controlled by the elite. Agriculture became structured around plantation-style systems, another direct echo of the American South. And so, within just a few decades, Liberia had all the trappings of a functioning state, a constitution, a flag, and a government. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. A republic in name, a hierarchy in practice. This wasn't just the founding of a new country, it was the beginning of a replication, and like all copies, it came with flaws that would only deepen over time. By the mid to late 1800s, the Republic of Liberia was no longer just a bold experiment, it was an established reality. But what had been imagined as a haven of freedom was beginning to look more like a mirror, reflecting the very hierarchies and inequalities it was meant to escape. Let's start with the political structure. Freed African Americans, those Americo-Liberians who had founded the nation, held all the power. They formed a tight political elite, controlled the presidency, wrote the laws, and dominated public life. Indigenous Africans? They were excluded from voting, citizenship, and most forms of political representation. In many cases, they were even seen as uncivilized and in need of uplift, a chilling echo of colonial justifications used elsewhere. So instead of creating a unified nation, Liberia developed what could only be called an oligarchy, ruled by the few. And that ruling class? It didn't look inward, it looked back toward America. The economic system reinforced this divide. Americo-Liberian businesses were granted monopolies by the state, consolidating wealth and restricting competition. Free enterprise, the supposed engine of prosperity, was throttled. If you weren't part of the elite circle, your access to opportunity was limited from the start. So ask yourself this: how can a free market thrive when only a select few are allowed to participate? Even more troubling was the incentive structure. The governance and economy of Liberia began to mirror the antebellum American South. Wealth was tied to land. Labor was structured around rigid hierarchies. The same tools of exclusion and exploitation were quietly repackaged in a new setting. And here's the uncomfortable truth: while Liberia was founded by people escaping slavery, it adopted many of the social and economic mechanics of the very system they'd fled. The result was long-term inequality. Indigenous groups became permanently marginalized. Over time, this created deep resentment, fueling tensions that would simmer for generations. In the end, the great irony emerged: those who had once been the colonized became, in some ways, the colonizers. Americo-Liberians imposed laws, taxes, and cultural expectations on native communities, often with little regard for consent or inclusion. It forces us to ask a painful question: was Liberia truly a project of liberation, or just a new kind of control with a familiar face? As Liberia entered the 20th century, the structures built in its early years began to harden. What started as an elite-led republic had become a centralized system locked in place, rigid, hierarchical, and vulnerable. And into that system walked a foreign power with rubber on its mind and profit in its sights. In 1926, the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, a major American corporation, acquired over 1 million acres of Liberian land. Let that number sink in. Over 1 million acres. Suddenly, a single foreign company held enormous influence, not just over Liberia's economy, but over its politics too. This wasn't just business, it was leverage. With Firestone came jobs, investment, and infrastructure. But it also came with dependency. Liberia's economy became tied to a single export: rubber. And not just rubber, rubber for an American company, sold to American markets, priced in American dollars. Think about the consequences. When one crop dominates, diversity vanishes. When one partner controls the market, sovereignty weakens. As Liberia's economy grew more entwined with foreign aid and trade, it became less resilient and less self-sufficient. What began as a republic had now become a client state, functioning, in many ways, at the mercy of outside interests. But the damage wasn't only economic. The governance systems, already designed to favor Americo-Liberians, now further marginalized tribal groups. The US-aligned structures deepened ethnic divides and sowed seeds of future conflict. Indigenous Liberians, already excluded from political life, found themselves pushed even further to the margins as resources and power concentrated in elite hands. And what about decision-making? Here's where things get dangerous. Foreign aid, meant to help, created distorted incentives. Leaders no longer had to answer to their people. They answered to donors, to creditors, to corporations. The result? Short-term policies designed to attract money and maintain control, not to build long-term national strength. Institutions decayed, corruption spread, and all the while, the veneer of stability remained. But it was just that, a veneer. Beneath the surface, tensions were growing. Economic fragility, ethnic division, and political centralization had created a pressure cooker, and soon, it would explode. By 1980, the cracks in Liberia's foundation had become impossible to ignore. The old order, built by Americo-Liberians, propped up by foreign capital, and insulated by centralized power, was finally about to break. And it broke violently. In a sudden military coup, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, an indigenous Liberian from the Kron ethnic group, seized power. For the first time in over a century, the Americo-Liberian elite were ousted from their position of dominance. It was a seismic shift. For many, it felt like justice, a long-awaited reckoning. But it didn't bring peace. Instead, it opened the floodgates. Doe's regime quickly devolved into authoritarian rule. Backed by the United States for most of his tenure, because of his anti-communist stance during the Cold War, Doe received millions in aid, even as his government became increasingly brutal, corrupt, and ethnically divisive. Here's the paradox. The West, in the name of stability, ended up propping up a regime that dismantled democratic institutions and suppressed dissent. Once again, foreign policy goals trumped the needs of the Liberian people. As ethnic tensions grew, so did resentment and violence. In 1989, a rebel group led by Charles Taylor launched a civil war that would plunge the country into more than a decade of chaos. Multiple factions, foreign mercenaries, child soldiers, and warlords tore the country apart. And the victims? Civilians. Entire villages wiped out. Children abducted. Infrastructure destroyed. By the time the fighting subsided in 2003, over 250,000 people were dead, and the nation's already fragile institutions lay in ruins. All the systems that had once given the illusion of order, foreign aid, elite governance, rubber exports, collapsed. And the real Liberia, the one silenced and suppressed for generations, exploded into view. But this wasn't just a civil war. It was a systemic failure, a breakdown caused by generations of exclusion, economic dependency, and centralized power that never truly belonged to the people. This was not a sudden tragedy. It was a long, slow unraveling, decades in the making. So what can we learn from the story of Liberia? At first glance, it's a tale of good intentions gone wrong. But dig deeper, and you find a cautionary map, one that reveals the dangers of building a nation from the top down, instead of the ground up. Liberia was born from a vision of freedom, but it was shaped by the hands of outsiders, by American elites who saw it as a solution to their own internal problems. And from the very beginning, its systems were imposed, not chosen. Its economy was tied to foreign interests. Its political power was hoarded by a transplanted elite, and its people, the indigenous majority, were excluded from the very project meant to include them. The result? A fragile state, vulnerable to collapse the moment outside support weakened or internal pressure rose too high. It's tempting to call this a failure of leadership, but really, it was a failure of structure. When power is centralized, when economies depend on a single export or a single investor, when democracy exists only on paper, instability is inevitable. Now here's the real question. What if Liberia had been built differently? What if its systems had grown from the local level, from tribes, communities, elders, and cultures already rooted in the land? What if governance had been participatory, not paternalistic? What if the economy had been diverse and decentralized, instead of tailored to benefit foreign corporations and local elites? Would the story have ended in war, or would it have evolved into something stronger, something more resilient? We'll never know for sure, but history leaves clues. Liberia isn't just a footnote in the story of African independence. It's a living case study in how systems, especially political and economic ones, can either empower or exclude, stabilize or collapse. And in that sense, it's not just Liberia's story, it's a global one. So the next time someone tells you that freedom can be gifted, or that institutions can be imported wholesale, remember Liberia. Freedom isn't something you export, it's something people build for themselves. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this video thought-provoking, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We dig deep into the stories you weren't taught in school, stories that still shape our world today. And if you want more history that challenges the mainstream narrative, explore our other videos. There's always more to uncover when you look behind the curtain.